it does mean that you don't have to try you're not a failure if you're not an expert at everything, if you don't have answers for every single problem that is brought to you.
Right.
And people have these enormous expectations. But in your community are people who have those gifts, those backgrounds that you can call forth, that you can help that, and you can really start collaborating and seeing, God pouring out into your parish and through your parish into the neighborhood around and the world around in all these extraordinary ways. And if that is pastoring.
Welcome to the Huntley Leadership Podcast, helping leaders be a positive catalyst in the people they support, the organizations they serve, and the communities they live. This podcast will make you think, laugh, and grit your teeth with new determination to make your parish or business a place of transformation, passion, and purpose. If you're still breathing, you are powered for impact.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Ron Huntley. Welcome to the Leadership Podcast, where we seek to dive into issues that matter, that help you lead not only your life, but influence others in a way that make people great. Our guest today is no stranger to the podcast. Weddell was on the episode the other day. We had a wonderful conversation about the whole Caldon Gifted book, but also all the work that went in before that. But there was some unfinished business. I'm so glad to have her back today so we can dive into the whole idea of charisms through the Caldon Gifted Workshops. So Sherry, welcome back to the show.
Well, it's great to be back, Ron. Thank you very much.
You are welcome. One of the things you talked about, you kind of just touched on it and we kept going. I wanted to get back to it, but I thought I'd save it for this podcast. You mentioned at one point you converted to Catholicism. And I wonder if you could just give us some insight into what that journey was like and what brought it about.
The short form, is basically I grew up as a true fighting fundamentalist in southern Mississippi. So the real ones, not those northern ones. This is the real thing. My family, it's a long story, but my family, because my father, who came from a nothing background, had a conversion shortly, basically after I was baptized as a child, a massive one, but he ended up on the far, 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 far right-hand edge of the fundamentalist world, for which there is no, well, there are some Catholic equivalents, but we won't go there. Okay.
Yeah, fair enough.
It was so far out there. It was way outside the norm. Okay. And so I grew up not only fundamentalist, but actively anti-Catholic. So I lived two doors from St. Church, which I regarded as the anteroom of hell, clearly, because as a 8-year-old running by barefoot one summer morning, I stuck my head in the door because I thought, what's inside there? And it was dark and there were candles burning, which clearly was demonic as far as, from my perspective. And I said, it's all true, ran past, so those sorts of things. So I grew up with this very, very, negative association. So my turning point was as an undergrad. At the University of Washington in Seattle, went through my adult conversion, and I felt very old, and very sophisticated. You understand?
Yeah, and, very old in university.
Very old and very sophisticated, and but time as an adult to deal with these things. And but what happened shortly after my conversion, I was looking on near campus that I could go to pray during the day, and Protestant churches were closed, but there was this big Gothic Catholic thing a few blocks away that was open during the day for reasons that I had no idea. But I don't know why I felt the courage, but I opened the door, walked in, and felt a presence of God that I had not experienced elsewhere. And of course I had no language. Now the church was named Blessed Sacrament. Did I have any clue what that was? Of course not. So far out on my horizon, I had no categories at all for anything like it. But I knew there was a presence of God there that I hadn't encountered in Protestant churches. And so I started praying there. I started going there as my prayer place because it was open during the day. And my friends would say, if you don't stop doing that, you're going to become Catholic. And I thought, dumbest thing anybody's ever said. I mean, come on. Because I still had all that anti-Catholic stuff in my head. And then there was really, in terms of the thresholds that we talked about last time, and I knew nothing about them, of course, at that point. But there was a turning point I remember I saw it was a Dominican parish, and they had a statue of this young woman, and there was a sign that said Catherine of Siena, though I didn't know any idea who she was. But I knew I had picked up by reading things as I was during my prayer times that they had, like in the bulletins and the vestibules and stuff, that Catholics, these were saints. They represented saints, and saints could pray for you. Now, I didn't know what a saint meant, but it was obviously an outstanding Christian of some kind.
Sure.
And so completely on the spur of the moment, I turned and I said, "Hey, Kate, you're a young woman. You get it." I said, "I desperately want to know what God wants me to do. And so if it's okay," and then I said, "And Lord, if there's anything wrong with this, if it's not okay that I ask her to pray for me, I'm really sorry. I don't want to, diminish your glory in any way. I don't want to, but if it's okay, Kate, could you pray for me that I could figure out what God wants me to do?" And then the very next moment, I don't even know why, spontaneously, I turned my head to the ceiling like God was up there and said, "Lord, if there's anything to this Catholic thing, I'm open." And yes, I had crossed into openness without a clue in the world. I had declared myself open. And when I came across the thresholds years later, I thought, "Oh, I can't believe that's what happened." That was the turning point.
The stuff I wrote about is actually true.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, So anyway, that was a big turning point for me. So it wasn't like, there are a lot of people who read their way into the church. I had lots of friends who did that, and they had very different questions. I had a mystical experience, and that was my turning point. But because my primary way of prayer was practicing the presence of God, I was acutely aware of the presence of God. So when I encountered something new that I knew was God, then I thought, okay, this is not to be dismissed. So that's my turning point. So it's really different than most people from my background, are reading Newman and all this stuff. Well, I got around to that eventually, but that wasn't the real reason. So,
I'm so glad I asked the question. Like, what a cool story. And even as you're saying it, I have the church in my head. I can see you as a young university student. I can see where you were sitting. I can see the statue. I'm just painting the picture in my mind as you're describing it. And it's just so amazing. Scott, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Scott Hahn in terms of the anti-Catholic piece. And then this coming to this place of openness, to your point of the thresholds. And then God, the sovereign work of God, does what only God can do. Wow. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So it's, I entered, when people say, "Why did you enter?" I said, most people have other reasons. I say I entered to follow Jesus. I was already following Jesus, but I wanted to be at the center of his church on earth and not on the periphery.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be where his work of redemption was at the center of worship. So
beautiful.
That's
beautiful. And so all of a sudden your relationship with Kate, the whole Catherine of Siena, it's still like, oh my gosh, okay.
Well, that was Catherine was also in the future. We didn't actually name the Institute Catherine because of that experience. We did it because she was such a great example of a lay apostle, because she was a lay woman and not even a nun as such. She was a lay Dominican, even though she wore a habit, as was traditional in her time. She was a lay missionary evangelist who had an apostle who was having all this impact on the church's life. And I founded the Institute, co-founded it with my Dominican pastor, who was the pastor of Blessed Sacrament. He came later, but yes, he ended up there, and we got to work together. And so the Institute came out of our collaboration, and we found a Dominican who's the perfect patron for what we were wanting to do. So there you are. Yeah.
How cool is that? Beautiful story. So how did the evolution of the Caldon Gifted Workshops, tell me that
preceded the Institute, because right after I finished school, the guy I did a sort of an internship my senior year, and he asked, I was doing it with a man who was a layman who was working with the charismatic renewal in the Seattle area. And at the end, he said, well, would you like to create a way he says, we've got lots of people who want charisms. They're interested, but they don't know how to discern them. Would you like to create something? And I thought, you're that kind of cocky place you're in when you finish school and you think like, whoa, sure, I could do anything. And so I said, well, that sounds interesting. I don't know anything, but why not? So that
I love youth.
Summer, literally that summer, which is actually 30 years ago this summer, as a volunteer, completely clueless, I just sat down and sort of sketched out and created what is still the basic structure of the Caldon Gifted without knowing anything really. I was using lots of Protestant materials because that's all I knew at the time. And, and offered it for 20 people that fall. And it was, they hired me as a result. They said, okay. So they hired me part-time, and I kept reworking and, learning and creating more and thinking, well, that looked like a good idea at the time, but it really sucked in practice. So now I'm back to the board again. And you have to have a lot of tolerance for failure. And
right.
But I listened. I learned a lot by listening. I said, I had listening built in from the very beginning. I sit down and 1 hour with every person who went through and said, after they went through the workshop, they took the inventory. And then I said, talk to me about your experience. Tell me a story. And that's how I really learned. And so slowly I created the training. I just rewrote things. And then by the time 3 years later, the Institute was created, we had it. It was I was already structured. People had heard about it. People were coming from all over the city, not just charismatics, but non-charismatics. And that made a really great combination anyway. Right. And so that's what we had. And we used it as a place to also articulate the vision for the apostolic call of all the baptized and their leadership in the church and all of that. So that became our structure. And so that's why since we've had about 143,000 Catholics go through all over the world now at this point. And and we've learned a lot more, obviously. But now I have a lot of collaborators.
It's such a beautiful thing youth is a beautiful thing. Like, Steve Jobs and Wozniak, in the garage creating Apple. And there's just so many cool things that happen at that university age, because you're right. That is a neat time of, hey, I got this. And of course I can do that.
Or you expect, you're searching, you're out there, your life isn't determined yet. And you're just wondering what's next.
This a go.
I really did. That was since I was a teenager, I had prayed intensely, wanting to know what God wanted me to do. And so, but I certainly didn't expect to find it inside the door of a Catholic church, but yes.
So for our listeners that might not be as familiar with the whole idea of a charism, how would you describe that for them?
Charisms are gifts of grace. It's a term that St. Paul uses in the New Testament. It just means gift of grace, but it's a very particular kind of gift. It's a gift that I am given to give away to others. It's not just for me. Now, there are other graces that are given to us that we're used to, like sanctifying grace that we talk about in the sacraments. They're for us to keep. That's for the sake of my relationship with God. But the charisms are for others. So they're ways that God's love and mercy and beauty and truth and healing and provision pass through me with my cooperation, but for other people. Okay. So they're different, understood in the church's tradition as a different kind of grace. And this distinction's been made since the earliest church. I could trace it through all the history and Thomas Aquinas and all that, but you don't really want to go there. But all I'm saying is it wasn't made up in the 20th century. This goes back right to the beginning. And the early fathers wrote about it. It's in the scriptures, et cetera. Okay. In the New Testament. So the whole point is, but these charisms were debated at the Second Vatican Council. It's the first time in the history of the church that the mission and dignity of the laity was actually debated at a conciliar level. It's the only time. And that was for the debates on the decree on the laity. And one of the things they debated were the charisms, and were they really given to all the baptized? And if you imply that, then you're taking away the authority of the bishops, etc. And so there was one of the great speeches of the council by Cardinal Sunans about the charisms and the universal call to be apostles for all the baptized. And it was a turning point. And of course, that was what the fathers discerned was the voice of God, and went into all the documents of the council. And it's in the catechism, and it's in a number of magisterial documents since. And yes, I've read them all, but the whole point is it's very deeply embedded in the tradition now. So discernment. Now, here's what's really interesting and related to what you do.
Wow.
Okay.
There's,
I do a lot of work with clergy. I've done a lot of work with clergy since Forming Intentional Disciples came out. And so we have to talk about what they call the 3 tasks or the munis of the Pastoral Office, which is to teach, to sanctify, and to govern, which I'm sure you're familiar with in your work. But governance is very interesting because governance covers evangelization, calling people to that encounter with Christ that changes their lives. It covers evangelization and all the spiritual forces unleashed by evangelization, which include the charisms and personal vocation, which are not the same thing. The two are not the same. They're related. I can talk about that.
Please.
And so governance is if you look on the directory for bishops on the Vatican website, this is where it's all laid out. But so governance is, as I said, evangelization and everything that comes out of it, including helping all the baptized discern their gifts and with their charisms, and helping all the baptized discern their vocations. And this is part of the pastoral office in the church. Okay. Now, in practice, of course, priests are not formed to do this ever. I know, because I've done it with a lot of clergy.
Sure.
And understandably, most of their energy goes into basically, especially sanctifying, which would be the liturgy and worship and all, and then teaching, which is preaching, in the ministry of the word. But this governance piece is ignored most of the time. There's very few structures for it and we're not forming leaders to do it. But in fact, of course, the church also teaches that every layperson is responsible for their own discernment, and we're responsible to be walking with one another and helping each other discern. So it's not like we're just supposed to wait for pastors to do this. We have our own personal responsibility in this area. And anyone who is in any leadership position in the church, formal or informal. So if I am a catechist, if I'm on the RCA team, if I'm on the parish council, or if I'm a staff person, a parish or diocesan level, we are participating in the pastoral office by delegation. Okay, in a different way than a priesthood, but we are participating in it. And the truth is, we all have responsibilities in these areas. So that's the Caldon Gifted was essentially, ultimately, a way to facilitate. It's the only structure of its kind, still, actually, that's really rooted in the church's teaching that helps people discern, actually go through a discernment process. And so there's sort of 3 parts has been since the beginning. There's a workshop that we do, an intro, just to kind of the basic ideas, because this was brand new to people. People kept saying it's like one woman came up to me and she goes, just listen, I'm 52 years old. I've been a Catholic all my life. I went to 12 years of Catholic school and 4 years of Catholic college. And how come I've never heard any of this before? And I'm like, well, then I have to go into my spiel about the council and the debates. And I said, I know the word's been really slow getting out, but here it is. But it was true. It just wasn't taken seriously at the local level, which is, of course, and we always understood that for 98% of us, the parish is it. I mean, we don't have lay movements necessarily in our backyards, only if you're in urban areas. And in the U.S., we're so big, the gigantic spaces and everything. We don't have much access to a lot of that unless you live in certain places. And so the parish, for a lot of us, is the only place we're going to encounter the church and be supported as emerging disciples and apostles in our own right through our baptism. And, so that was the vision from the beginning. So the Caldon Gifted was created to be done at the parish level, ideally. Though it also gets done at diocesan levels and things like local levels too.
Sure.
But what we do is give people a chance to begin exploring. They take an inventory, not because it is determinative. It is not proof that you have a charism, but it's a quick and dirty way to sort through your life experience to this point and identify best places to begin discernment. Because you could go, how are you going to know where to start?
Right.
Well, we want to, narrow it down. And then you come and have your one-on-one interview where we listen to your stories and we say, oh, I see I had a high score in hospitality. What were you thinking when you answered those questions? Do you have a story? What can you think of an instance? Tell me the story. And then we train people to listen to their stories and recognize evidence or not of a charism, help them hear what's going on. Because sometimes they themselves don't know because they've never put it into words. Nobody ever asked. Nobody ever listened. And so that all of a sudden they start to hear and recognize and see connections they hadn't seen before. We help them pick a charism to experiment with. That is to do. Because this is Nike country and you just got to do it. You don't dream about these things, just do it. If you think you have a charisma teaching, you have to go teach something to someone and see if anybody learns. It's that practical. Or leadership or encouragement or music or healing or whatever. There's a wide spectrum of charisms we help people discern. It's not exhaustive. These are just some of the most common charisms. And so we're teaching them a process. And then the third part is you pick a charism and you actually experiment with it a minimum of 2 hours a week for at least 8 to 10 weeks. Ideally, and in real life, it's going to be longer, but most people won't commit to more than that at the beginning. So, and the idea is you experiment on your own and then you get together in small groups and you talk with other people who are also exploring and you talk through what happened. So, okay, I'm looking at this charism and this is what I did. Here's my story. I don't know what this means, because this person said this and this happened and and then you talk it over and then you go out and you experiment some more. And then you come back and you talk and you experiment and you talk. 2 to 4 weeks into that process, the light starts to dawn for about 50% of people who had patterns already at work in their lives that they hadn't recognized. Or maybe if they're experimenting with something brand new, they start to see patterns emerging. We teach people to listen for the feedback you get from others because charisms are real. They are not fantasies. In other words, they really make a difference in the world around you. And so people give you feedback about what they receive from you. And you have to learn both to welcome that and to recognize it and take it seriously. And for a lot of people, I have to give them permission to do that because for many Catholics, that feels arrogant. It feels presumptuous.
Right.
Aren't
I supposed to be humble and I'm nothing and God's everything?
I'm supposed to be humble and I can't, especially I might say women are very prone to this. So I have to give special permission to women to accept because they're worried it's going to disrupt their relationships at some level. So, but it's the same basic process for both men and women. And so we take them through a process. Now we're just teaching them a discernment process. I can't guarantee you'll know all your charisms at the end, but almost everybody has clarified at least one or more and has a sense of difference between the charism and just skills I have, natural talents, things I was forced to learn with life. The person who has scores high in administration, I've had a lot of this, and you ask them to tell a story, and while they're telling their story, and they're like, rawr. I mean, they look like you think they're battling World War III or something. I'm thinking that
I have a friend that's exactly what it
is.
Not
charism here. I'm thinking not, because the classic signs of a charism are joy, energy. It's compelling, joyful, it's energizing, it's satisfying. It's like prayer. It's like contemplation. You have a sense of the presence of God when you're using it. And so if I'm hearing, then I'm thinking, okay, well, that's fine. We're just going to keep asking some more questions here.
Going out on a limb here.
I'm just like, interesting, So, so I could tell you story after story, but we probably don't have time for that. But anyway.
Well, it's Sherry, as you're sharing, like I grew up post-Vatican, and so you're telling me this, I'm thinking, what? The church didn't, they didn't think that before the Vatican, like widely?
We lost track. It was talked about a great deal in the early church. That's why we have St. Paul's letters on the topic. We have a lot of the early fathers. But what happened, as far as I've been able to figure out, after a point when about 400 years after, 350 years after Jesus, the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its religion, right. Formal religion. And what happened very quickly is that people all recognized where the new power was. And so the church grew about 500% in 1 century. People just poured in, not because of faith, but because that's if you wanted a good job, if you wanted connections.
Where the jobs are. Yeah.
That's where everything was. So we were all going to go there. And so what happened, a lot of very nominal people poured in. And then that triggered also the beginning of the monastic movement, because a lot of the serious disciples went out into the desert and started these communities out in the desert, which is the beginning of monasticism. So but what happened, and when you read, I won't go into details, but when you read some of the early documents, you can tell, like, okay, 350, Cyril of Jerusalem is talking about the catechetical lectures. He is lecturing. We have his lectures to people joining the church, adults joining the church. Right. And he's talking all about the charisms and how important they are and, and what you're supposed to do. Okay. And then 50 years later, John Chrysostom, 300 miles away, is writing, where are the charisms? They're supposed to be here, but they seem to be vanishing. What has happened? Okay, he knew they were an absolutely necessary part of the tradition. He says, without them, the church is like a woman with a beautiful jewel box, and she opens it and there's nothing in the box. There's no jewels. So they recognized. And anyway, over time, the assumption was it was only for the very special, only for saints. If you manifested one, it was a sign you had an extraordinary call. You were not supposed to be an ordinary layperson. Obviously, you were supposed to go, hie thee to the convent, the monastery, whatever, because you were clearly not normal. But ordinary Catholics, ordinary lay people didn't expect to manifest these. And so anyway, it's a long saga. But what happened this was revisited historically in terms of the church's development in the late 19th century, and then into the 20th, these issues kept rising, and they came to the fore in the debate on the decree on the laity.
Wow. Thanks be to God, eh?
Yeah.
That's so cool. That's an interesting perspective. I remember, you talk about people's feedback. I remember it's an embarrassing story in many ways. I was not a good student in school. I found sitting still difficult, and reading and comprehension was painful for me. So I was a really slow reader. So I found school really challenging. And so I fumbled my way through academics. And I remember I had this really strict teacher. Her name was Miss LaRose. God rest her soul. Apparently she's passed since. And boy, she was strict. She taught biology, which you have to memorize. I couldn't memorize. I was happy that I could fill out my name every time. And so it was the last day of school. I was scraping by in biology. I had my fair share of detentions. Last day of school, she said, last minute of the class, could Ron Huntley and Angie Romke please stay behind? I want to talk to you. And I'm thinking, it's the last day of class. I didn't do anything. And why Angie Romke? Like, she's a perfect student. She's on the student council. She's just a model human being. Loved her to death. I was lost and troubled. And so everybody left, and she comes towards us, and I'm so confused. And she pulls out these 2 brochures, and she said, there's a leadership camp that's taking place this summer. Both of you have incredible leadership capacity, and I think you should talk to your parents about sending you to this camp. And I remember thinking to myself, what are you talking about? I'm not a leader. And I walked out of the class. I threw it in the garbage. There was a garbage bin right outside the class. Just so happy I didn't have a detention. And off I went. But I never forgot that. And it was later that hearing that from other people, I remember saying to God at one point, and again, it's the openness threshold around that piece.
Yeah.
For me, it was like, God, if I'm a leader, because I heard it enough time from enough people,
Sure.
if it's true, and I'm not saying it is, but if it is true, I want to use that gift for your glory in the church. And so I'm going to stop saying no, and I'm going to start saying yes. But Lord, all for your glory. And I remember praying that prayer in my 20s.
Wow.
But to your point of feedback, you know?
And to have, what's so fascinating about the process on so many levels. First of all, it tends to draw people who are often on the peripheries, not the usual suspects who are involved in everything.
Right.
They may be too busy and their lives are full. They don't, but these other people are sitting there going, what do I do? And so we get a lot of them. It draws them out of the peripheries into the center until they're known and seen. For many people, we've heard this over and over again. I have never told this story to another person. And they've had these extraordinary experiences of God that we are totally silent about in our communities, which would energize all of our faith if we knew, but we have so few mechanisms to hear these stories. And to have them honored and to really have someone listen, not just casually, but really trying to say, what is it God is doing in your life and how is he leading you? So there's all kinds of incredible stuff that happens when you start discerning charisms. If we evangelize, the charisms are going to start popping because they tend to manifest in your life at a certain point. Now, we all have them. We're given to them in baptism. So they're like seeds underground in winter in Colorado, seeds underground in winter in this place. And I'm a gardener and I'm 7,000 feet high in the Rockies. I'm telling you, it's serious winter. So it looks dead. Your garden looks dead, but it's not. Okay. They're all underground and they're filled with the life of God and they're just waiting for spring. So the charisms in many ways when you start to evangelize, they start to manifest in people's lives. With them comes leadership in the area of the charism. We have to talk about that. This massive creativity. With them, there are also important clues as to one's personal vocations. There's all kinds of factors that come with this. And it, on so many levels, it is crucial. I mean, as we talked last time, helping people make the journey to where they actually enter into a living relationship with a personal God who they think might actually be kind, might actually care about them, etc. That's a huge turning point. As they continue to move, they get more and more curious about Jesus, and they begin to wrestle with, am I going to follow him as a disciple in the midst of his church? It's about that time as people move maybe into seeking, maybe into early discipleship, the charisms start to manifest. And we've heard this story many times. They said, I'll say, about 2 years ago, I went through this retreat and I had this experience. And then this thing showed up in my life. And what is this thing? So it could be somebody who suddenly has a passion for working with the poor, or somebody who feels drawn to intercessory prayer, or you name it. I mean, I have story after story after story. But no one was around to kind of help them recognize the call that was coming with them. There's a leadership in the area of the charism that comes with you. And all sorts of things like that. So it's facilitating discernment. That's why the church says, it really mandates that we're supposed to be helping every single baptized person. Well, first of all, we want them to enter into that relationship with God, out of which these charisms manifest, but then to help them discern them and to answer the call that comes with them, which is crucial to the flourishing of the church in every generation and to the building of the kingdom of God in every generation, in every situation the church finds herself. And so that's what we're doing. And that's how it was through the Caldon Gifted process and listening to people that we got moved into evangelization, because we realized people couldn't discern because they weren't disciples yet. And that's why they were struggling so much. But there's the discernment issue is really interesting because it's just as true for clergy, and it's true for leaders. And your charisms will, it's how should I say it? You will distort your job or your ministry to make room for your charisms, period. Regardless of what your job or ministry actual job description says.
Give me an example.
Oh, good.
That's a funny statement. So give me an example.
Okay. True story. I'm not naming names here, but let's just say I was at a parish meeting with a Dominican, and Dominicans are, I've worked with a lot of them. Okay. And they're brilliant. Yeah. And so there we are. We're at a meeting supposedly about painting lines on the parking lots.
That's a good meeting.
Okay, it's an exciting meeting, but he wanted to turn it into a graduate theological seminar. And he kept popping out all these. Yeah, well, it was actually a charism of knowledge, but he was popping out all these massive ideas, and then so frustrated that the people were just going, but I'm here to talk about the lines in the parking. And I'm like looking on and going,
right.
Come on. But you will do it. We've seen it over and over again. So the thing is, as I keep saying, do everyone around you a favor and figure out what your charisms are, so that you're not doing this
people with them
and giving everyone around you the fits. You need to know as much as possible. Ideally, now all of us have commitments and responsibilities in life that mean that we will be active and responsible in areas where we don't have charisms. That's okay. Yeah. But to the extent that it's possible, you want to, if you will, major in your majors and not your minors. So you want to shape your work, your community involvements, your service at the parish, whatever, around your charisms. You will be most fruitful, most effective, have the biggest impact, and you will be energized, joyful. It is healing. It is nourishing indirectly for us. Now, that we can't do it to get there, just to get to the good feels, because they're gifts for others. That is what it's about. But as you obey that call, what indirectly comes back to you is that it is healing, energizing, satisfying, joyful. It makes your faith in Christ grow, your relationship with God. It's just, and it's the great remedy for burnout and cynicism. We have never met anyone who burns out in the exercise of the charism, ever. And cynicism, to see God working, really working in the lives of other people, you just go, whoa, okay, this isn't just a political hack. This isn't just a grind. This is real. This is all real. And,
oh my gosh.
In many ways, one of the things for clergy, governance, which includes calling forth the charisms and the vocations of all.
Yes.
Because they're not given an opportunity to do that. They're not given formation in that area. And honestly, of course, most of them are overwhelmed anyway. But it means that a part of their priesthood is not being expressed, is being repressed unintentionally. Okay. Yeah. And part of the great, what would I say? The reward of the vocation of priesthood is seeing new disciples and apostles emerge around you, because that's 100%. The evidence your priesthood is bearing fruit. And that says what I am doing. I'm not just keeping the ecclesial trains running on time, more or less. Okay. Maybe not, maybe less than more, but you know what I mean? I'm not just frantically, trying to keep everything going. I am seeing people's lives transformed. I am seeing the power of God being, pouring out into the world through my people, through my community, that I am fostering and leading. I'm being a real spiritual father. And it's the joys of a real father when you see your children growing up and becoming these fabulous, wonderful, unique human beings and adults with all this love and creativity. And the joy and the satisfaction of that is one of the great rewards. So it's all of this. There's so many ramifications of this. And the fact, as I say over and over again, there is someone out there right now who is waiting for what you have been given to give, and their life hangs in the balance. That's the economy of grace, folks. That's the world we live in. And it matters that you say yes. That person, you may not have met them yet. They may not even have been born yet, but in the providence of God, you are the one who's been gifted, who's been prepared for that person, that community, that family, that business, that neighborhood, that circle of friends, whatever your call is, wherever God is placing you. And it matters that you say yes. And that,
I think my heart's just grown 2 times its regular size. I can feel it in my chest as you're talking. My heart is just expanding and ready to explode. It's so exciting what you're saying. It makes so much sense.
It is exciting. It's and to see it lived, to live it yourself, to see it lived over and over again in places all over the world. It's one of the great.
I can't imagine how rewarding that must be for you and your team. I just want to come back to a couple of things, because one of the things I'm seeing you do, Sherry, which I think is so fun, like, do you put on all the workshops yourself and do all the interviews yourself? Of course not.
Ha!
Right? Impossible.
No, of course not. No, from the day one, I've always taught with other people, because it's better teaching technique. They can identify with different people. We have different stories, different life experiences. Yeah. That strengthens it, and you trade off all the time. You're playing off each other because you're collaborating. Right. We saw it, and I was teaching for the first so many years with my co-founder, Father Michael. We wanted to model lay clergy collaboration, have people see it. Most people had never experienced that one.
Right. That's true. I remember Father James and I doing the same thing at our first conference. One of the keynotes we were going to do, he said, Ron, I want people to see our relationship, so we're not going to practice our talk. What? He said, we're just going to talk about this, but we're just going to get up there and we're going to make it up. And we'll have some points, but we're just going to reveal it in real time. And it was so fun, because he too wanted to model a working relationship with clergy and a lay person. It was what was so neat about it afterwards is so many people said, I might not be a James Mallon, but I can find my Ron Huntley. So in other words, it doesn't matter who you are, you can have a partner in crime, somebody who can make you better, who has different skills and gifts that you do, that you can bring the best out in each other for the God's glory. And that's what I hear in you too. I remember experiencing Patty Mansfield that way.
Collaboration, knowing your charism, knowing where you're gifted and where you're not gifted. It's a both and.
Yeah.
That sets you up for collaboration, fruitful collaboration.
Amen.
And so,
Amen. I want to...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say,
no, go ahead, finish the thought.
Feel responsible to be like, and they feel that people project that responsibility on them, to know everything, to do everything, to be the final.
So true.
The expert in every conceivable area. In fact, when you come to terms with, okay, here's where my charisms are, here's where they're not. Now, I'm still the pastor. The church has defined that. There's a whole office there that, you can't get out of, and you're responsible to the bishop for some things you cannot offload. But it does mean that you don't have to try you're not a failure if you're not an expert at everything, if you don't have answers for every single problem that is brought to you. Right. And people have these enormous expectations. But in your community are people who have those gifts, those backgrounds that you can call forth, that you can help that, and you can really start collaborating and seeing, God pouring out into your parish and through your parish into the neighborhood around and the world around in all these extraordinary ways. And that is pastoring. That is effective pastoring.
That's what Jesus did. And that's what I see you doing. Like, you're sharing this great treasure, this insight. You're sharing your vision, your hope, how you've been impacted. And it's contagious. And people want to be a part of it. And so you're empowering them. And you like, I don't know your full organization, but I'm guessing that there's some structure there that's modeling it, growing people, training people, and releasing people, and then supporting people.
Everything we do is...
So we can add another zero to that 143,000, right?
Yeah. everything we do is along those lines. And everyone we train, and we train people now, especially now the Caldon Gifted is available now online, streaming in English and Spanish. So we're forming people,
awesome.
especially we had this all in place before COVID, thank God. So now we're training people, online. People from all over the world can be in the same training.
Yes.
And that kind of thing. So yeah, it's really been fascinating.
1,000 things going off in my head as you talk. I'm just getting so excited. But you mentioned these charisms come to life in the context or through evangelization. Oftentimes it's when somebody rediscovers or discovers for the first time this person of Jesus Christ and how much they're loved. And then all of a sudden they start. And so you may or may not know, Alpha's been a big part. Evangelization is a passion of mine.
Yeah.
And so but it's easy to go from evangelization to catechesis or evangelization to ministry. I often go from evangelization to forming them as leaders, because leadership is one of my charisms, and you say you inflict yourself on into whatever your ministry is. And I think to myself, like, how would you position the Caldon Gifted Workshops and this whole idea of evangelization as Alpha, or Christ's Life, or the Rescue Project, or whatever it is people are using for evangelization?
And we've worked with everybody doing everything. So, but what is interesting, and you have to understand, when I created this, I knew like zero. I presumed, because of the world I came from, that everybody was already a disciple, and therefore I was just going to help them discern their charisms so they could be apostles. And it took a lot of listening to people to realize there was a disconnect there somewhere. So it's been a long journey to figure that one out. But the whole point is we revamped, when we put it online, we went through a renewal, what do you call it? We revised the Caldon Gifted, not massively, but refined it, things I'd wanted to do for a long time. And because we had started to realize it was evangelizing in its own right. Why? Because most of the people who were going through were starting these very early thresholds. They were a trust or a curiosity, but a lot of them hadn't moved beyond that. And, but everything about it, from taking the inventory to all this, we tell endless saint stories and contemporary stories, and we listen to your stories and you're hearing each other's stories and, all this stuff. And everything about it presumes a loving, living, personal God who is active, who is pouring out his goodness on the world, who wants you to be an instrument of that. And it wakes people up spiritually. And so what happens, we've discovered, is that people go through all three parts of the Caldon Gifted. They usually come out at openness, even if they started to trust. So they're moving through the thresholds. And so we discovered it because some of the parishes we were working with were using Caldon Gifted as an evangelizing tool. And then people would come out of it, like go into RCIA, or they would go into Alpha, or, someone would come out of RCIA and go into the Caldon Gifted, et cetera.
Right.
So we intentionally reshaped it so that it was this evangelizing content. The evangelizing impact was stronger. Everybody who we trained to facilitate discernment now has to learn about thresholds and threshold conversations, how to listen to someone's story of where they are in their lived relationship with God, because that's now an integral part of the discernment process. We just ask that. And it is connected. It's honest, because as we tell them at the beginning of the workshop, we give them a chance to pray a prayer of openness now. We explain these gifts come out of your lived relationship with God wherever you are. And it's wherever you are is great right now, because that's where God's going to meet you. But this is before we start. We want to give you a chance to tell God you're open to more. You're open to whatever the next step is, et cetera. And so and we revisit that in the interviews, we revisit that in the small groups, et cetera. So we see people moving through the thresholds routinely now. And if I just parachuted into your parish for some bizarre reason, and you said, you can do whatever you want, Sherry, I would probably start with the Caldon Gifted. Why? Because the interview process is the most extraordinary pastoral tool I've ever encountered. You find out more in 1 hour, not only where people are in their lived relationship with God,
so true,
but where their charisms may be, areas of giftedness and leadership outside the parish, all sorts of things we never talk about because we only think of them as serving inside. It is a window to crucial pastoral knowledge that you could be side by side with that person for 20 years in a parish and have no idea. And in 1 hour, you'll learn more.
Right.
And so it has all kinds of phenomenal implications at many levels, but it is but having the threshold conversation, we know people often move just by telling their stories. And it's just so,
Right.
So what I would do is I'd probably start because it's so fascinated by the Caldon Gifted, by the charisms, and they come from all different backgrounds. And some of them are literally, I mean, I've had people in interviews who are like, prenatal, if you will, spiritually, completely.
Yeah.
And I've had great saints. I've had the entire spectrum. And
Yes.
wherever they are, they can move on. But for most of our people, so I would do that as a beginning stage with the idea of helping them move into openness so they'd be ready. The next thing I'd want to do would be charismatic. So that's where you get into alpha, or you get into Catholic Christian outreach, or you get into Christ life, or et cetera, the evangelizing retreats. There's a number of them. They're all very effective. But one of the problems is most of the people going into them are not really ready for the charisma.
Aren't open.
They're not open.
Wow.
They don't. Yeah. And that's why they're not necessarily, it's nothing wrong with retreat. It's a part of the journey they're on. Yeah.
Yeah. And the whole idea of what you're doing, and I don't want this to be lost on anybody, you're training people how to listen. And I would say listening is the number one skill set that great leaders have. It's the number one skill set. It's the number one skill set that great speakers have, is to be able to listen, because you need to know who you're speaking to, and you can pick all kinds of things up, and you're literally training people how to do the very thing we're probably least good at. And that is going to be so useful in a parish at every possible level as people you're training take that skill set and apply it to all kinds of different ministries, including Alpha.
It'd be fabulous for an Alpha table leader, someone like that, because that's what you're doing. You're hearing their stories. RCIA, imagine if you had threshold conversations before, an inquiry, before people enter into the process.
Yeah.
There's just endless applications.
Parish council, as they're discerning
Parish
together,
council,
collectively discerning, right?
Counseling, marriage prep. It goes on and on and on. Retreats, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, the implications are very broad and enormously powerful. So yeah, that's been partly why. Now, you understand, I didn't understand any of this when I started. Only slowly have we seen.
Let's be clear.
The ramifications of all this. Yes.
Well, it's funny. Even last night, I woke up at 3 a.m. I usually don't do that, and I couldn't get back to sleep. And it was in that moment, or in that time of just reflecting, that I started to write down all the things I do in leadership coaching and being an impact partner for priests and bishops. And I had all new clarity last night. And it's just neat how, as you continue to do what you do, you continue to grow in clarity. And it sounds like that's been your journey through these Caldon Gifted Workshops and Charisms.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My gosh.
So, yeah.
My goal, I have a new goal in life, and it's to put a 0 at the end of your 143,000. I want everybody to this is just so good. How do people connect if they'd like to try it and or like to be trained in it, or if a parish or a pastor's listening, or parish council's like, we need that Caldon Gifted at our church? Where do they go from here if they're listening?
The first and fastest thing to do is go to our website, which is just siena.org, SIENA.org, siena.org. And those just go to under Caldon Gifted, and sort of all laid out there. You can, if you choose, you can, leaders can, pastors or whatnot, we can set you up so you can just see the online version beforehand. We do both live and online, and then sort of joint things where we train people to facilitate, but to be a trained facilitator, you have to go through yourself first. You have to have done your own discernment, because you can't empathize and grasp process if you haven't done it yourself. And so that's part of the process. And and so, just drop it, or if you're just curious, send an email to info@siena.org, info@siena.org, and just say, I heard Sherry on the Ron Huntley, podcast, and I'm interested, and we'll get back to you.
Teach me more. Yeah, that's so perfect. I wasn't meaning that as a way of landing the plane, although all of a sudden it feels like it could be that. But I wanted to ask you, how has your discerning of your charisms impacted your life? Tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, heavens. Oh, my gosh. Well, for one thing, they manifested early because I went through conversion early. And so they started manifesting while I was in college. But I didn't have any help. I just, one of the first that showed up was like intercessory prayer, et cetera. But it only slowly, it took some time. The last one that manifested that I became clear about was leadership, because I had confused that with being the most popular kid in the class. Now, I was definitely not that.
Oh, interesting.
So, but I didn't take in the fact that every once in a while I'd say, "Hey, gang, we could do this." And everybody suddenly turned around and saluted. And I'm like, what are they all doing? How come? Why do they keep doing this? They're all smart people. They don't have to wait for me to come up and say, "Gang, we could all do this," but they do. Anyway, so yes, it has. And I will just one thing, this was fun. Because,
please. Yeah.
After Forming Intentional Disciples, the book went viral. If we will, our opportunities and our workload quadrupled more or less overnight. And I remember just, I was just running. And one day I woke up and realized, everything I've been telling people about charisms all this time is true, because otherwise I'd be dead. I said, it really is energizing, satisfying, joyful, all those things, and it gives you this tremendous energy, because it's compelling, and it never runs dry. Your sense of what God will do in the area of your charisms, and the need for them and the impact of them. And it's interesting because if you're, how when you're living, there's a lot of people who they're not yet in their place in the world, in life. And so they're looking around, they're desperately trying to find a place, or maybe try to take somebody else's place, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's, you often see people and they're doing that. But when you're using a charism at that moment, see, you don't want to be anywhere else, even if it looks strange and obscure to somebody else. When intercessory prayer manifested in my life, one of my friends said to me, "But you're off in a corner. You're just praying for people. I mean, that's so, nobody sees you." And I'm like, "What do you mean? I'm here at the center. This is where God is entering the world. Are you kidding me? This is where it's happening. What do you mean I'm off in a corner? I'm not off in a corner." But but you don't need to be seen. You don't need constant patting on the back and massaging and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's good when it happens, but because the thing itself, your sense of being where God wants you, and He is entering the world here, and He is, entering it, and so it is on so many levels, at a human level, in terms of your spiritual life, in terms of collaboration with other people, in terms of, and your charisms will name some people. They'll be drawn to you because they have similar gifts. You can articulate a vision around that charism, and people will be drawn to it, which is why it comes with a leadership in the area of that gift. There's, the ramifications are enormous, and the charisms the church literally teaches we have a communion of charisms. My fruit that I bear through my charism belongs to you, and your fruit belongs to me and the rest of the church. And to the extent that we are not calling forth our charisms of our people, facilitating their discernment, we're not first calling them to, of course, that encounter with Christ out of which all this comes, and then vocations that come and the charisms that come. Every time we do that, we are weakening the church in incredible ways. We are sucking the
life clean
the
out of it.
life out of her, because God intended, this is one of the ways he intended the church to be nurtured. And this communion of fruitfulness, this communion of charisms that we are all part of is essential, especially in a hostile missiondom environment.
Yes.
We're outside of Christendom.
Yeah.
And now the living, not the institutions, will not survive by themselves if they do not have the spiritual power of the gospel and of the graces of God and the Holy Spirit, underneath us. And so, one of the foremost things that is crucial, here's my rough estimate. This is just, there's no studies. This is just Sherry talking.
Sure.
My best estimate is about 2% of all the charisms we've been given are actually being manifested and exercised right now. Right. Part of it is because of where most of our people are in terms of their lived relationship with God. That's a foundation. And part of it is we have not been talking about this, help facilitating this, nurturing it. The church, how the church flourishes in hostile environments is directly related, as I said last time, to the number of our percentage of our people who make the journey to discipleship, in whom the charisms manifest, who discern personal vocation, who bear the fruit, the abundant fruit that remains. And that nourishes the whole church, the body of Christ, even people who you do not know. People, you're sending out ripples out into history that will nourish the life of many, many others, even in centuries to come. And we know that because we've got the communion of saints. This is all part of the communion of saints here. So yeah, this kind of stuff is crucial. Every time we help someone discern, we're helping to facilitate someone to answer a call of God that has huge ramifications for many people whom they may not have met yet or even know exist. So yeah, there's
that's
ramifications
the
are huge.
Starting point of the work that I do with priests is I'd use some of the language you use, but I've done it. I'm gonna do it again. And get more familiar with this body of work. Like I say, I've done it and I've been through the interviews and I just loved it. But then I get myself so busy that I know a lot of what your work has done has influenced me, even to the degrees I'm not aware. And that's always the starting point for me. But I also think, as you were talking about burnout and just the grind that can be in our jobs, and I think about bishops who I get to work with as well, and how much most of the time, I haven't met a bishop yet who doesn't love their priests. Now, they might not know how to show it in a way that it's received or interpreted that way. But when you talk to them, most bishops I've ever talked to, their number one priority is the priest that they father. And if they took the time to work through this body of insight and revelation, to understand the charisms of their pastors, they could love them in a way they're currently not. There's such a disconnect oftentimes between the presbyterate and the bishop.
Being a pastor varies
100%.
tremendously based on their charisms, which is not
one
bad.
way to do it.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing, but it's different. And so, yeah, there's and the burnout among priests and or leaders of any kind. Let's face it. That's
true. You can be a business leader too and be in the same situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If you don't know who you are, you're going to try to either be somebody else or you're going to try to live up to the things everybody else says you should be. And those are two terrible ways to live your life. You only get one life. You should figure out the author of your life and maybe partner with him. And that's what Caldon Gifted allows you to do, is to partner with the author of your life.
Yep. And to answer, to be open to receive all the graces, and then deliberately cooperate with them and answer the call that comes with them. Yeah, make yourself available. There's a discipline involved in all of that, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and people listening, particularly leaders and pastors, will be really excited about the practical nature of what you're talking about. Like you say, it's not all just pie in the sky. It's
Oh,
like,
no.
no, like it's rooting you in your identity and then giving you a place to experiment so that you can live a life of purpose and meaning that will build up the kingdom of God.
And you will see a great deal more effectiveness. One of the classic stories I had, this is a quickie.
Please.
I was interviewing on the phone a school teacher, a school principal, Catholic school principal, and
Okay.
and she scored high in administration. So I said, "Tell me a story," and she told me a story about bringing the parents of her children back to the church. I said, "Well, I'm making a note, going, well, that's a fascinating story," and I put evangelism down here. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking, we want to stay with administration. So that was fascinating, but that's not exactly administration. Could we go back to administration? I sort of defined it again. I said, "Could tell me administration story." She told me another story, bringing the parents of her children back. 3 times I asked about administration. 3 times she responded with evangelism, and I finally had to say, you said this, 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 and this. I just have to point out, that sounds more like evangelism than administration. And you could hear the horror, the gasp,
Right.
1,400 miles away as she said, "Oh, I couldn't do that. I'm a principal. I'm an administrator. I'm this, I'm that, I'm that." "Yes." And I said, "And apparently your understanding of what that means is you're going to evangelize the parents of your children," which, is one of the primary reasons for a Catholic school to exist.
Right. Yeah. That's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's part of the DNA of Catholic schools. But
Isn't that neat?
yeah, and that I can't tell you how many conversations we've had like that of some kind. And the same would be true. And I know I have some sense, because I've also worked with, quite a few bishops, the crushing burden that many of them are carrying now.
Painful.
And, but one of the abiding sources of strength and ongoing energy and consolation, honestly, is fine. If you don't have it, you're going to have to make a space in your life. If it doesn't come with the situation you're in now, then you go find it and you create it. And I've had to tell people, I've said, "I'm sorry, I know what your job says, but you need to go over here and create a space to exercise your charism, because you need this. And God has not given that to you accidentally. This is an assignment. This is a mission. This is an anointing for a mission. And it's essential to your spiritual life, to your personal stability and growth, your ability to answer God's call long term. All sorts of things are involved. So
I remember, being at an event, and they're facilitating conversations, and so you teamed up with somebody you didn't know, and it turns out he was an Anglican bishop, but I didn't know that. There was nothing in how he presented himself that I would know that. But he talked about being involved at that time. It was an Alpha event, or hosted event, and he said it's what gives him hope in his ministry as a bishop, because there's so many other things that he has to deal with that are urgent problems and complicated problems, and not a lot of light in some of those problems that he had to wrestle with. And he said, if it wasn't for this opportunity to be with people as they come into a relationship with Jesus, he doesn't know how he'd be able to continue. And that's your point. Like, if whatever, and for him it was probably evangelization, but whatever your charism is, find a way to live that out. You're going to be happier. You're going to experience less burnout, and you're going to have a bigger impact. And
your trust in God will be strengthened in God's presence, in God's saving presence and action now, in and through the church, in the midst of it, despite all the stories and all the media and all the seemingly endless scandals. The truth is, especially at the ground level, this is where we're going to see a lot of this light emerging in people, in and through people as they say yes. Yeah.
Beautiful. So as we land this plane, this is the plane landing part. But oh my gosh, I could talk to you for days. Like, I get so excited because what you're sharing makes so much sense, and it mobilizes and activates everything I believe to be true in the local parish and the global church. But what is your hope? So what are we looking at? We're in 2023 right now. So let's say it's 2033. So 2,000 years after Jesus comes
Yep.
or came, what is your hope for the body of work that God's called you to? Like your gifts are my gifts. Like your charisms are, I'm benefiting from your charisms. Our listeners are benefiting from your charisms, which is exactly how we know it's a charism, as you were saying earlier. What is your hope for your team and this mission and call that God's put on your life with this Caldon Gifted Discernment program? What's your hope for the church? What's your hope for that ministry?
Hope for the church? Well, we are here. The Institute specializes in, if you will, facilitating conversion and, if you would, an apostolic formation for all the baptized. But we create one-of-a-kind, cutting-edge resources that don't exist. We never duplicate what somebody else is doing. We see no point in that. But we do create the out-of-the-box thing. And there's a number of places that we're working on creating new stuff right now. We're right in the middle of it. But here's my dream.
Yeah, please.
I became aware about 10, 15 years ago, maybe. I stumbled across the story of the great 17th century French revival called the Generation of Saints by historians, in which they had survived 32 years of religious civil wars in which millions of people had died between Protestants and Catholics. So that, anyway, it was a disaster on every conceivable level. But out of the rubble emerged this generation of disciple friends who mentored each other, collaborated with each other, stole from each other, co-founded, taught each other, mentored each other, prayed for each other, shared, stuff with each other. And together, it wasn't like they consciously at one level decided to set out to do this, but the impact of it, and it was a very broad spectrum. There was women and men, there were the poor, there were the high and the mighty, there were religious and priests and lay people, and a huge spectrum. They took everybody seriously. That's one of the things that was really stunning. And they pursued revival in 4 crucial areas of the church's life. The parish, the diocesan pastorate, the renewal of religious life, and the laity. Okay. And they had massive breakthroughs in all 4 areas. And that revival changed the Catholic Church. It was totally Christocentric. It was the most Christocentric sort of Catholic movement they had seen in centuries. And that revival impacted the nation for 150 years. And spread from France to North America, to Canada and places like that, to Southeast Asia, which is how the faith reached Vietnam and all those places. And more, as even in a year of the Eucharistic revival, I just became aware just 2 days ago that adoration by the laity at the parish level came out of the French revival, which practically almost everything that's really powerful and life-giving in our structure, they invented out of whole cloth because the old world had been destroyed and they were starting over from scratch. They were in shattered Christendom and they had to reinvent the church in an evangelical mode, a missionary mode. And and we name our churches after these people, Francis de Sales and St. Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac and St. John de Chantal. And I could go on and on. There's a bunch of them. But there were tens of thousands of different at different levels of the church's life involved in different aspects of this immense revival. And that's, I don't know of anything else like it. Even revivals in the Protestant world, and in the Protestant world I came from, they follow these and they teach about them, but they're usually very short-lived, maybe a year, maybe 2. They have great awakenings, which are longer lived. But this was the longest, if you will, great awakening that Christianity has ever seen. It was multi-generational. It had the ramifications were still working. They invented the retreat house. Why? Because if you have a lot of lay and diocesan priest disciples who don't have religious houses to go to, you have to create a place where they can go and pray. I mean, so you make disciples and then you start creating all these structures to support them and, nourish them. And so that's the question is, I'm absolutely certain God is calling right now. I know he is calling for it. That the next generation of saints, they're emerging around us. We don't know who they are necessarily. They may be small children. They may be teens. They may be middle-aged or elderly people who are unseen, but they have been given the call. God has placed them in their time. They have these charisms, and they're emerging around us, and we don't yet see them. But I know they're there, and I'm praying for them right now, because that in one of the church's darkest hours, what changed it was the emergence of a whole network of disciples and apostles who together, as friends, as collaborators, as, learning from each other, etc., changed the course of history. And God used them to do that. And there's no reason it cannot happen with us. No, and I know, yes, the last 5 years have been really tough for everybody. And institutionally, a lot of dioceses are, consolidating parishes and closing them and turning them into, whatever they call it, families or pastorates or whatever, collaboratives. But in the midst of institutional decline, the key is always the spiritual renewal of people.
Amen.
If we call them to that encounter with Christ, out of which all of this flows, and we answer the call not just as individuals, but together, there is no reason we cannot see another generation of saints emerge in our time, in our generation. They're already out there. We just don't know how to find them, and we may not be looking for them. They're going to blow our they're going to come in forms that are outside our categories, but they're there. The charisms are there, the vocations are there.
And I think the work that you've done and the work that God is doing through you, I say this to other people, not just you, but Sherry Weddell and the work she's doing is pioneering that next movement of faith. Before I heard that story, there's been a movement afoot in my lifetime, and I've experienced your pioneering work as ushering in the things like divine renovation, rebuild, all these other things. Not that they're intentionally connected, but there's a movement of the Spirit to bring about these powerful CLI, Patrick Lencioni's work, and all. I just see this outpouring, but it all started in a sense with if that's part of the root that's leading to this renewal, from this university girl who needed a place to pray, rooted in prayer and this longing and this desire to be at the epicenter of God's grace. And so thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your courage. And when you get this new body of work done up, I would love to have you on again so I can learn a bunch more and inspire all kinds of more people to learn from the work that you and your team are doing. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's thank you for giving me a chance to have this conversation and learn from you and hear what you're seeing as well, because my experience is my dominant charism is wisdom. And my experience is wisdom people are always fascinated by other people's wisdom. So, yeah.
It sounds like I have some more discernment to do, because I have been fascinated by this conversation, and I'm sure our listeners are too. So again, Sherry, thank you for being on the show, and for all of you that have been listening and continue to lean in and find ways to make a difference, to bless others, to bring your parishes to life or your businesses more in line with what's in your heart as a Christian. Let's continue this journey together. Let's continue this conversation. Please leave comments, send a note. Again, reach over to Sherry's Institute to get some information and maybe start this in your church, because listening is going to be the road to falling in love with one another. And if we're not in love with one another, we're not going to renew our parish. And so let's take that as our assignment, and we'll see you next week. God bless you.
I want to encourage you, as you lead this week, be faithful to God and generous to others. See you next time, and remember, if you're still breathing, you are powered for impact.